Welcome. Thanks for coming out to the Humanities Forum. I'm Jim English. I direct the forum. I've been doing this now for going on 4 years, and I think it's the first time we've had an event addressing my favorite topic of food. So it's like, yes, finally. Our film series on the work of Bradford Young and the new black cinematographers kicked off last month, a few weeks ago. We now had the second of those films, and we started with really a fabulous panel discussion with Mr. Young himself. But this is our first event of the so-called spring semester. Devin is just reminding me of the gap between the nomenclature and the felt reality of this term. It certainly seems like winter, but nonetheless, the spring semester. This is the first event back here in Rainey of our color series, which will be continuing all year long. Next Wednesday, we'll have a public conversation about public art in Philadelphia. These were on the screen a minute ago. Jane Golden, who founded the Philadelphia Mural Arts Program, is going to be here along with two artists who've done notable murals in the city, and Amy Hillier of the Penn School of Design, our distinguished colleague. They're going to show some slides and talk about the important role that these works of art play in various neighborhoods and communities of color around Philadelphia. So that's going to be an interesting evening. The following week, on the 25th, we have David Eagleman, the renowned neuroscientist and best-selling author. He's written a book most recently, Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain. He's going to be telling us about his latest research on synesthesia. He's written a book about synesthesia as well. It's the involuntary crossing of two sense, I don't know what they call them, pathways or something like that in neuroscience, but two different perceptions, so that you end up with hearing in color or counting in color, these kinds of phenomena which have been of interest to writers, artists, philosophers since antiquity. So that's on the 25th. I want to mention as well that the Julian Agumon event that we had scheduled for last month but was snowed out because Professor Agumon lives in Boston, which is now, I have a sister in Boston. They, I think, are pushing over 80 inches of snow in the last 3.5 weeks. So if it's been rescheduled, and our brochure, which gives the original date, has now been updated with a little insert. So if you're interested, you could grab one on your way out. All these events and the others that we're going to be hosting in March and April have been developed by this year's topic director of the forum, Qiming Yang, my colleague in the English department. She's an expert on English literature of the 18th century, but her work is centrally concerned with China as well, and with the wider system of East-West cultural trade and cultural politics. In addition to being in the English department, she holds positions on the faculty of East Asian Studies, the Asian American Studies program, of Cinema Studies, and indeed she contributes importantly to the curriculum and research in all of those programs. So Qiming is now going to introduce our speaker, Krishnendu Ray.
Thanks, Jim. When we think of color, we tend to think visually, but as tonight's lecture will bring out, color also has to do with the sense of taste and with multi-sensory bodily experiences of food. Now, food can be very playful and fun, but it can also be very serious. As one astute scholar has beautifully put it, we do not think it necessary to narrow our sensory horizons in order to sharpen our intellectual vision, contrary to what dominant Western epistemologies have assumed since the 18th century. Those are the words of our distinguished speaker for tonight, Krishnendu Ray, from his co-edited book, Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia. Professor Ray's work on food is philosophically astute, politically and anthropologically rigorous, and also poetic, I might add. Of immigrant restaurateurs, he's written, and I quote, "An immigrant is an inverted anthropologist, flowing in the wrong direction in the incline of global hierarchies, but with the same advantages of awareness of the tacit dimensions of a practiced body and everyday experience because of the very act of displacement." In his books, Professor Ray studies what he calls a globalization from the middle rather than a top-down phenomenon, and restaurants for their important location in what he calls the space between the public and the private. He is also the author of The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali America Households, which is a fascinating account of how food is what he calls a place-making practice. He is associate professor and chair of the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University. And I learned he was also just elected the president for the Association of the Study of Food and Society. Before coming to NYU, Professor Ray taught at the Culinary Institute of America and was the acting dean of liberal arts and management. His next book-length study, which comes out with Bloomsbury Press in 2016, is entitled Immigrant Restaurateur in the American City, Taste, Toil, and Ethnicity. Tonight, he'll be speaking on the topic of colorful food and the Asian American chef. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krishnendu Ray.
Thank you, Chiming, for that kind of lovely introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks for coming today. And thanks, Jim, for thinking of inviting me here, and thanks to Jose. I don't know, I can't see you anymore, you're in the dark. Jose Romero for insisting that we cook before I talk. So I've been cooking since the morning. We had a good meal. Mixed one. Some things came out good. The okra came out good. The pakoras came out good, and the chicken was too dry. We had left it in the oven for too long, and it's kind of like real life. It's a mix. It was a mixed bag. And Sarah for arranging the logistics, and Penn Humanities Forum for inviting me here. Jennifer and Timothy Roman for doing the dishes and cleaning during and after cooking, which is in fact the most thankless job really, because it's not heroic. I got all the credit for cooking, and you got dumped with all the cleaning. So anyway, that's life. So let me first, in fact, frame the material I'm going to present to you today. And you can see I was struggling to articulate what I was trying to say. It ends up with kind of almost 3 titles, and you will see references to it. So the first place to begin is, since occupations and birthplace have been identified beginning with the 1850 census of the US, data shows a strong correlationship between food service occupations and new immigrant groups. So the foreign-born numerically dominate certain occupations such as domestic servants, hotel and restaurant employees, hotel keepers, saloon keepers. These, by the way, are the categories of the census of that time period. Bartenders, traders, dealers in groceries, bakers, and butchers. I'll show you some data right now. In contrast, predictably, members of the so-called white-collar occupations, such as clergy, lawyers, school teachers, government officials, have mostly been native-born. So this is, you can't read what's on the x-axis from the back, so it gives you just a broad visual one. The blue data point is US in all, and New York City is the red one. And this is percentage of members of an occupation that are foreign-born in 1860, just before the Civil War. 1850 is the first time we have census on occupations and birthplace. But some of the 1850 data for New York City is so small that the percentage doesn't make sense. Even here, you see restaurant keepers, 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th data set is 100% foreign-born. It's a slight exaggeration. It gets kind of enriched as we go further. So I want to show you some of the, this is, I'm jumping, of course, this is every 10 years, but this one is every 50 years to give you a sense of it. Again, US data generally tends to be less foreign-born in most professions. New York City data tends to be more foreign-born in professions, in the occupations. And here you see, of course, predictably, lawyers is going to be, anything that depends on English language familiarity is going to be the least foreign-born. When I started looking at this data, I didn't expect bakers to be almost 80% foreign-born in New York City, and nationally, quite high, almost 60% foreign-born. So this is the kind of the broad data set. If you look at, say, even when immigration had subsided, and here you have, starting off, lawyers and physicians. For instance, I was surprised by the physician data. I thought it's a relatively recent thing, but in fact, if you go back, you had a lot of German and Irish surgeons. And of course, in the early census, that's when surgery was not a consecrated profession. In fact, they were with the barber surgeons. And then you have teachers, and that was the guild of the barber surgeons. Surgery does not take off until you have anesthetics and antisepsis as an important profession, and in fact now is the highest paid American professions. And then you have teachers, and then you have saloon keepers, bartenders, again bakers. It's astonishing to me that bakers have dominated these foreign-born categories. And of course, in the data so far, you did not see cooks because cooks were not counted. Cooks were counted amongst servants. And 1910, for the first time, and that's when 1950 data, it shows up, it says cooks except private. The except private is that cooks who are not servants in the household. So that's, that also changes, and then you begin to see by 1950, the end of it, you see waiters and waitresses. And one just last one, the broader point is, in fact, this astonishing ubiquity of immigrants in food-related and caregiving activities. The 2010 census also confirmed this pattern. What was intriguing to me was, given this kind of data, it would be perverse to be interested in immigrant lives and uninterested in food, either as a matter of political economy, of entrepreneurship, or, and I'll talk about it a little, or the cultural politics of transaction in taste. Yet, surprisingly, that was the norm until relatively recently. So although the journalistic material, if you look at the New York Times, if you look at any major newspaper, and I'll show you some data, material is replete with stories of immigrant restaurateurs. There's surprisingly little scholarly work of greater duration that theoretically engages with taste in the metropolis from the point of view of the immigrant entrepreneur. Of course, there is a robust literature on ethnic entrepreneurship, and there are a number of common parts to it. One, of course, is that low capital requirements make it relatively easier for foreign-born entrepreneurs to enter into the business of feeding others. And knowledge about unfamiliar foods gives them a competitive edge over, in fact, better capitalized mainstream entrepreneurs in the kind of marketplace. And then social capital of kin or fictive kin networks of loyalty that allow the lending of money on a rotating basis without collateral. Usually they can't go to bank or provide collateral for a loan. They can go to their within ethnic networks. And these are some of the things that enables ethnic entrepreneurs to raise the necessary cash for a small eatery and without the assets or a bank loan. And of course also based on self-exploitation, which is long hours of work and unpaid labor of kin and fictive kin, permits these enterprises to compete with better capitalized businesses and turn sweat and loyalty into capital. And large corporations often, in fact, cannot respond quickly to fickle changes in fashion, but small entrepreneurs small enterprises can adapt with speed and thrive. Hence, there is much greater room, in fact, for small enterprises selling food and other things that are attuned to quick transformations of taste. And they're too risky for large capital with large investments. And hence, especially in crowded marketplaces like big cities. Finally, and most importantly for our purposes, both migration and entrepreneurship exhibit serial pattern. That is, people who know each other have typically migrated from the same regions and work in and own similar enterprises built with money and expertise, in fact, from co-ethnics. So they effectively develop an informal, intra-ethnic, you can say, consulting and banking system. So paucity of assets to collateralize bank loans and unfamiliarity with language and norms of a consumer society deepens this dependence on co-ethnic money, information, and cultural expertise. So co-ethnicity is a powerful labor recruitment and management system that allows also quiescence and exploitation. So the point is not to get too sentimental about it. This, of course, is the broad prototype of an explanation and a structural one that needs to be fleshed out with the real activity with real life everyday people. And the structural model cannot explain, for instance, why and how the first Bangladeshi or Pakistani entered into the Indian restaurant business in New York City. That demands biographies and micro-histories. And recently is a fascinating work called Bengali Harlem by Vivek Bold that reveals these potentialities in a very finely drawn kind of portraiture of about, he follows 24 itinerant Bengali peddlers of chicken, a textile, circulating from Hooghly through London, Durban, New York to New Orleans in finthesical 19th century, sliding into the interstices between the dying throes of a British Empire and the birth of American Emporium. And all these men left some of their compatriots behind to keep the tethering posts of their networks in place. In distant cities, they in turn, out of pure necessity and unrestrained desire, built some of the earliest, for instance, South Asian boarding houses, coffee shops, eateries, and restaurants in their places of inhabitants, occupying the thin edge, and which in some ways continues till today, between, in this case, Indophilia and xenophobia. And it kind of, you play in that funny and very interesting space. So much of the ethnicity and entrepreneurship literature attends to economics and politics, as if immigrants are creatures only of political economy who never think about taste, beauty, and how such things might interact with their practical moral universe. So the propensity to ignore immigrant bodies in the disciplinary discussion of taste may be a product of the tendency to see discussions of taste as marginal to the real lives of marginal peoples. So in this conception, poor, hardworking people can teach us about poverty and suffering, hierarchy and symbolic violence, which is true, but never about taste, which of course is untrue. As a consequence, taste, I think, loses its contested and dynamic character, and I would argue even its fundamentally sociological nature. There is, of course, a theoretical problem with food in the modern Western imagination, especially within academic scholarship. Food has long considered trivial, now condemned as fashionable, too fashionable, in fact, in popular culture, has compounded its entry into the academy. Only a handful of historians, for instance, were some of the earliest and anthropologists who for long have engaged with food, especially of the other. But amongst historians, especially those working revealingly with, in fact, working class histories or ethnic histories, such as Harvey Levenstein, in fact, the typical trajectory used to be you work on labor history and you do your consecrated research on labor history, but the outtakes of that labor history would be your food history because you couldn't get tenure based on that. And so then of course Hasia Diner's work, Donna Gabaccio's work, to name some of the pioneers, have been able to break through, I think, that triviality barrier. And so it's interesting that these are all historians of the poor who have taken the poor people's view that ignores the traditional rich people's view in the modern West that cooked food is trivial and can make no contribution to our understanding of aesthetics. So various reasons have been accorded, of course, that you are familiar with the absence of food in classrooms and libraries and museums. Among those is its, of course, fragile nature, its ephemerality, its tendency to rot, but also, I think, inordinate attention to the mind and thinking in the liberal arts over the body and modes of doing things. As modern subjects in the academy especially, we are trained to be pleased with our minds and surprisingly blind to our bodies, other than as shallow concerns of vanity. There are, of course, two exceptions that should come to mind right away. One is the primitive's body, and we repeatedly return to in various disciplines, especially in anthropology's long history, and of course the diseased body, which is medicine, nutrition, the backstory of the department I come from, and it was the trajectory where I come from a department called nutrition, food studies, and public health. So we have physicians, physiologists, microbiologists, and then public health statisticians, and a few historians, a few cultural sociologists, which was, by the way, born out of this quest by our public health nutrition chair, Marion Nessel, who was kind of frustrated by the public's disdain for nutritionists. She said, we have a very good idea as to what is good for people, what is good to eat, but people don't seem to be listening to us. And she says, maybe we don't understand people, which is why she hired 15 years ago the first historian in the Department of Nutrition and Public Health. And then they hired me as a cultural sociologist, and now we have an economist and a political scientist, etc. So the primitive's body and the diseased body have been allowed entry into the academy for over a century, of course, but only as ontologically inferior things in anthropology, nutrition, especially nutrition, and the health sciences. And such a containment of the body, I think, is crucial to Enlightenment dualisms, of course. Yet normative disembodiment is not only limited to the sphere of the West, because strands of Brahmanism, which is one of the points of my departure, also make a crucial argument against the abject materiality of the body, especially the socially inferior's body and its lack of liaison with the divine. Perhaps that is because food and the body have for long been considered the concerns and cares of the inferior, that is women, servants, slaves, and subject races and castes. Superior men have theorized away the body and its needs, especially of food and for sex. And I see that the Penn Humanities Forum, next round, is on sex. Of course, we know the reclaiming of sex, at least in the Western Academy, through Freud and psychoanalysis. But food, that's what's happening to food right now, in fact, about 100 years later. But that concordat is disintegrating all around us, particularly in the Western Academy, precisely because I think that's where it has ruled the roost. Let me just give a quotation from two historians, Alberto Capati and Massimo Montanari, in noting how, in the beautiful work, they say how pizzas and pasta have become the most recognizable signs of Italy the further one goes away from Italy. Making a telling point relevant to us here, which is, and I quote, spaghetti and pizza belong to a legacy that has spread throughout the world just as books have. Literary writers have no precedence over cooks, and neither do their artistic visions have any particular usefulness in matters of cooking. Yet their role is no less important than the cook's. Along with the exchange of food products, dishes, and flavors, there's also an exchange of documents and recipes. So this lively traffic is vital for good taste. In fact, without realizing it, when we eat spaghetti, we are also ingesting something of Dante Alighieri. On that ringing note, Capati and Montanari flatten the aesthetic hierarchy, set in place, of course, by the very same Renaissance. Yet the sharpest retort to old-fashioned theorizing, that is, as critique of critique brings theorizing and doing together, had already been preemptively delivered by the 17th century nun and Hispanic Baroque scholar, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who in responding to the chastisement of a powerful bishop noted, I quote, "If Aristotle had cooked, he would have written a great deal more," end quote. De la Cruz was articulating a subtle theory of knowledge while making room for the caregiver's ways of knowing the world in the kitchen, the parlor, and the nursery, and in fact, thinking about it. Kathy Davidson, in fact, recently, in her 2013 presidential address to the Modern Languages Association, noted the same thing, that we must, I quote, "redesign our institution and modes of instruction, not just for critical thinking, but for, in fact, creative contribution. We need to encourage not just a culture of critique, but a culture of making and participating." This is Kathy Davidson, 2013. So with that, now let me go to the specificity of the question. For the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do today is take you to the heights of the culinary profession, at least what it looks like from one city. That, in fact, is sociologically analogous to, say, I would argue, to the literary world or, in fact, the art world. And that is the kind of the discussion that is emerging quite overheated in places like Manhattan, in places like, in fact, Philadelphia, with its hierarchies and closures often organized around color and gender. So I'm going to show you colorful food. I'm also going to talk about color in terms of race. As you will see, it is a weird world. And it is, in fact, a weirdly interesting world. And it reveals something about it. So on 18th November 2013, chefs David Chang, Alex Atala, and Rene Redzepi graced the cover of Time magazine under the title, "The Gods of Food." The lead article title, if you didn't get the point, the lead article read, "The Dudes of Food." So including elaborate family trees that did not include a single woman. The elimination of women from the pantheon of cooking is extraordinary, but not accidental. Furthermore, of the 58 named chefs on 4 family trees, 50 out of 58, 55 are European, American, Australian, or Canadian. 1 Japanese, Seiji Yamamoto of Nihon Ryori. 1 Mexican, Enrique Olvera of Pujol, and 1 Chilean, Rodolfo Guzman of Borago. Alan Richman noted recently in GQ that this new style of cooking, I quote, "is entirely male. I found no exceptions," he writes. "Not once have I seen a female chef," he's saying that a little exaggeration, but to the point, prepare such food. "Men have always dominated restaurant kitchens, but I don't ever recall encountering such gender-specific cooking. The chefs work with like-minded discipline, hardly ever haunted by doubts, seemingly in possession of absolute confidence, to say nothing of the adoration of customers. Nobody is telling them what they might be doing wrong. The food is intellectual, yet at the same time often thoughtless," end quote. So along with the question of exclusion of women, I think what is equally interesting, in fact, is to account for the difference is what gets included. And almost all of them Asian, and especially Japanese or Asian American men. Okay? So of the, for instance, the San Pellegrino top 50 best restaurants of the world. By the way, you claim such kind of weird lists. That's the nature of in fact, a definition of a field. Like we have best novels, best movies, and anything else, okay? We have Yoshihiro Narisawa at number 20, who cooks French-style food in Tokyo, and at number 22 we have Seiji Yamamoto, cooking Japanese food in Tokyo. So almost everyone else is white and male. Such publications highlight chefs from like the Wall Street Journal, the Culinary Institute of America, the CIA, the other CIA, which was, by the way, a shock to all my radical friends when I said I had joined the CIA. References are often to Taiwan and Singapore, rarely extending that attention to China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., India, all of mainland China, or anywhere in Africa. So those, in fact, regions do not play in the global culinary discourse because they cook and talk differently than what counts in the social field of culinary capital. So that's kind of a population base of about 3 billion people. Then if you account, of course, for the exclusion of half of the world's population, that is women, we have an astonishing distillation of the heights of the field of haute cuisine. And understandably, of course, the Time magazine cover provoked a firestorm of criticism from female chefs in the US, with Amanda Cohen of Dirt Candy raising the claims of Barbara Lynch, Dione Lucas, Madeline Kamen, of course, Julia Child, among many others, Alice Waters. In quick retaliatory response, Grub Street produced a list of goddesses of food, which listed Alice Waters, Elena Arzak, April Bloomfeld. I said, it gets very weird, this field, the naming and the reference in it. A reader acutely countered, I quote, "It's hypocritical to claim this list as a triumph for recognizing a diverse group of talented chefs where there are no people of color included and no one outside of Europe and North America," end quote. This is a reader responding to Grub Street. So even ideological opponents of the masculinization of professional chefs are trapped within the social confines of the field, which cannot account for certain kinds of differences while accounting for others. Furthermore, by the rules of the gastronomic field, the authentic chef has to be, and I'm going to talk a little about it, has to be original. In contrast to the authenticity of the ethnic cook, who is urged to reproduce the unaltered original. So these are two very different ways of fabricating culinary value. It is worth digging, I think, a little deeper into the contrasting language of these domains. And to do that, I'm going to enter the inscribed world of cookbooks because of their durability. They allow me a certain kind of an opportunity to hold the discourse still for sustained analysis. And so I will start with this section I call Celebrity Cookbooks and the Chefs They Produce. So Michael Batterbury, the founding editor of the highly reputable Manhattan magazines Food Arts and Food and Wine, compliments Suvir Saran's cookbook, Indian Home Cooking, as a redolent book of the simple home cooking of his native India, I quote. That brings, I quote, Indian cooking into 21st century American kitchens. Simple, native, and 21st century American kitchens are doing a lot of work here in terms of translating and transcribing between different groups of practitioners. Saran makes the classic moves of chefs who want to distinguish themselves from the down-market curry houses. He notes, I quote, "Some of these dishes are spiced quite differently from Mughal food and are unfamiliar to many Americans," end quote. He collates a collection of Southern Indian rasams, and which he references as my grand uncle, and then references as grand uncle's khichdi, etc., framing them within the linguistic gestures of authenticity, nativity, and familiarity. And that genuflection towards authentic expatriate domesticity is essential for the ethnic cook, which is quite different from the rhetoric of the chef, especially a chef's chef. And I want to show some of their work, as many have come to identify Thomas Keller. Suvir Saran's Indian home cooking, in fact, as you saw, is bristling with crimsons, emerald greens, and turquoise, like a bride decked out to seduce by her demure domesticity. The exact opposite of the demeanor and design of Keller cookbooks, or for that matter, El Bulli, Noma. The dust jacket of the French Laundry is minimalist and modern, with whites and beige and clear lines. Clearly, this is no ethnic thing. You and I know that. No loud color, no ancestral sentimentalism, no deep collective authenticity. Only individual originality. Austere, yet, yes, understated surely. Confident, even arrogant presumption of perfection. The name of the restaurant and the cookbook are, of course, clever, quirky, almost insider jokes, compared to the obvious referent Indian home cooking. Okay? French, yes, but a laundry? Well, the building was once a laundry where he built his first restaurant in Napa Valley. If you know that, you are one step inside crowd. Circa 1900, it was, by the way, it was also a saloon, a brothel, and a residence. Okay, I don't know whether the French brothel is going to work. Maybe we will see. The next set of chefs might be playing with that. But the avant-garde self-consciousness and homage to French haute cuisine works well with the name The French Laundry. It would become one of a brand with the artisan signature in the form of per se and ad hoc, two other reference in Keller's empire of quirky francophilia. Sam Sifton, the New York Times restaurant critic, opens his review of per se, and these are mutually constituting, the chef and the critic, in some ways shape each other. He writes, I quote, "So this is the best restaurant in New York City." That kind of a claim. Per se, in the Time Warner Center, just up the escalator from the mall, a jewel amid the zirconia, end quote. He concludes, I quote, "It represents the ideal of an American high culture luxury restaurant, where a dinner for two with wine would set you back $1,000. Sifton bestows the ultimate reward of 4 stars on per se. The introduction to the French Laundry frames the issue as the pursuit of, I quote, pleasure and perfection. Quickly, it plunges into a barigeole with salmon tartare with a sweet red onion creme fraiche, served in a tuile. You will see it in a picture later. It's up there. The pictures are rarely of, in fact, composed dishes. Mostly of stemware, kitchen utensils, squash blossoms, the chef, his hands, and the purveyor. So you have artisan and artifact. A whole realm of possibilities limited only by quality and skill. He writes, "I take pleasure in precision," and that's his, in fact, reputation in the field. Perfect food by the best bicoastal chef. And people take it seriously. Keller's is, in fact, the quintessential signature of the professional, where colleagues and family are generously acknowledged, but never the customer, in fact. That is the difference between, in fact, a professional and a quack. A quack panders to his customers. There is no hedging either in terms of the reach towards universal and abstract proficiency in his work, in his language. Timeless and placeless, different from the rhetorical style, say, of Michael Silakis, who is another category of a chef, a rising American chef playing in the medium of Greek food, with its distinct location in the hierarchy between New American and Indian restaurant cuisine that I have referenced so far. In the case of How to Roast a Lamb, no ethnic referent, but kind of a deep authenticity. The inviting title is familiar, and the subtitle, New Greek Classic, tries to make room between the old Greek ethnic diner and the new American fancy food. The acknowledgement is overwrought. The cover, classic Mediterranean, which is olive oil in a traditionally stoppered bottle, a lemon cut in half, garlic bulbs, bunch of thyme, and olives on a plate with a stereotypically Greek key patterned border. This is going to be about recipes and reminiscences. And in Barbara Kafka's foreword, identified as a book about contemporary Greek cooking, which deserves, she says, to join the pantheon of great foods of the world, end quote. Clearly, a cuisine that needs updating and promoting, a little like the native cuisine of India brought into the 21st century American home that we have encountered earlier. The first visual offering after the cover, in fact, is an old-fashioned spoon with a dab of Greek yogurt on a traditional oval plate. Nothing designer here. Deep essence and authenticity, underlined by old, torn black and white photographs of family and friends in difficulty, but with the possibility of joy. It is about families in hardship their intensity polished by adversity until they get to America and the next generation, the authors, comes along. It's a story about Cretan men, strong, stoic, and self-sacrificing, men among men, in his words, brimming with sepia-toned pictures and gorgeous recipes for salads with wild bitter greens, grilled onions, dried tomatoes, and kefalotiri, roasted whole fish, hanger steak with braised dandelion. I had one very specific goal in mind, Silakis says, to shatter the confines, boundaries, and expectations that had been imposed on Greek cuisine. I aimed to elevate the way in which Greek cuisine, the cuisine of my heritage, is perceived by critics and diners alike. The storyline that Chef Silakis is after ends with the soaring claim, I quote, "Greece is the birthplace of democracy and Western civilization as we know it today. It is also the birthplace of cuisine," end quote, if you didn't know that. That is one half Silakis swagger, and the other half insider ambition for outsider approval. From the evidence amongst the various evaluators of cuisine, such as Zagat's, for instance, one instance, Chef Silakis is not alone amongst Greeks in his hopes. In fact, Greek cuisine has been climbing rapidly in the estimation of critics. As a result, the average price of a meal, these are rankings, in 2014, the earliest is 1986 I have with Zagat material. This is top rank. You see the French and the Japanese instance is a very interesting instance of it, okay? The duration that's the oldest you can get in terms of data. I can't go further back, but that's kind of a fascinating duration over the last 30 years. And kind of you see the ranking of it in some ways. And elsewhere, I've said there's something about American fascination. One is a kind of a birth of a new American cuisine that has come into play, but there's also a clear sense of foreign sensibility, which is in some ways different from the ethnic sensibility. And Italian mixes it up a little between, in fact, the ethnic who in some ways become the design foreigner in some ways and returns. And the mix of it is a fantastic classification of what gets consecrated as culture. So in some ways what I'm pointing to, I don't have the time to go through all the details of this beautiful data. There's a whole architecture of global hierarchy already inscribed in everyday Zagat ephemera that has mostly been thrown away. In fact, I had the toughest time finding Zagat surveys because they're thrown away by ephemera. The oldest one is in the Library of Congress. That is the 1986. Zagat refuses to share theirs with me. So the Indian haute cuisine is also coming along in view among various critics and connoisseurs. It has this kind of a mid-space, and in fact, it is falling. It is under pressure in some ways, and you have seen what has fallen is southern very dramatically, and then you have Thai, Vietnamese, Chinese, etc. So Indian and Greek cuisine and personality of chefs are quieter, cautious incarnation of a radical new mixing of haute and not so haute. And that's the title of that I'm playing on with David Chang's work, which is, in fact, I shouldn't have given his name. I should have asked you who this is. If you know who it is, you are inside that crowd. If you don't know who it is, you are an outsider looking in this domain of haute cuisine. This is David Chang, of course. A second-generation Korean-American has mastered in the Manhattan fine dining marketplace. Chang's widely acclaimed Momofuku Empire, Noodle Bar, Sambar, Ko, Milk Bar, and so on. Many located, in fact, within a few blocks in East Village. He's a really smart, innovative guy. He blew open this idea that if he puts too many restaurants next to each other, he'll cannibalize. What he does is, in fact, synergize. All his restaurants are walking distance from each other. And in fact, I know it. I walk to one of them because I know if I don't get a spot in one, I'll get a spot in the other one. Okay? So he is kind of very smart thinker, and he also brings out a journal called Lucky Peach. Very smart journal. He's in that sense, in a Gramscian sense, an organic intellectual of a new domain in terms of cuisine. So, and of course now he's done it, replicated in Toronto and Sydney with less success. But there are, for instance, no tablecloths, no wine glasses, no elegant silverware, plain wooden chopstick. Quite radical. Shared tables, no chairs, backless stools, kinetic, young, interracial clientele with a ken for miscegenated food. The Momofuku cookbook, sorry, it's not the cookbook, but this is such a beautiful picture of the kind of food he does. So this is color and food, unavoidable, and kind of absolutely startlingly gorgeous food. He says, he says, bad pseudo-fusion cuisine. This is his words. That is at the leading edge of American restaurant food today, where labneh and samjang and Sichuan peppercorns and poached rhubarb all end up on the same plate. And very interestingly, okay, he writes, we are going to serve good food regardless of the environment, regardless of the paper napkins, the shitty silverware, the fast food style condiment island in the middle of the dining room, end quote. Chang brings us the possibility of ethnic-haute for the first time that is quite different from the somber, institutional, continental, French, Swiss, and Japanese cuisines we have seen so far play in the gastronomic field. But he's, of course, also influenced by a particular kind of Japanese food. So the Momofuku cookbook in style, design, and content lands right between How to Roast a Lamb and the French Laundry cookbook. It is a classic Clarkson Porter book with its clean lines, few colors, close-up of ingredients, dynamic, and hazy pictures of chef caught mid-activity, yet attentive enough to hire, I quote, a male hand model for all those crafty hand of the chef as artisan shots. That's a little line at the end of the book. In substance, what is radical here is that the inspiration is no longer a restaurant in the French model, but the great ramenayas of Tokyo. I like the periphery, Chang writes, of the culinary world. Fast food, ramen, subs, pizza. Simple and delicious food people could afford. Chang comes from the edge of the center, much like other Korean-American chef Roy Choi, for instance, on the West Coast. Choi, with Korean barbecue taco trucks, is one among a number of radical revisioners of the urban foodscape that includes pop-up restaurants in other people's kitchens, part performance art, part restaurant. It includes others such as Chef Sang Yoon, who is credited with the gourmet hamburger and the gastropub at a dive bar called Father's Office. Again, these names are these vague reference to insider stories. Father's Office being a hamburger place, okay? The French Laundry being the best restaurant, okay? So that's kind of the currency also of that conversation. So the traditional restaurant, what is interesting for me is you see the hierarchy, but you also see some of the popularity, populism, democratic potential in the aesthetic realm. This is the traditional restaurant in the Parisian model invented in the 18th century that so dominated all notions of Western culinarity is dying, in fact, right in front of our eyes. And in fact, in Manhattan, David Chang has helped that along. Though through that crack in the edifice, a whole lot of ethnic-inflected food is pouring into the domain of Manhattan haute cuisine, muddying the turgid classificatory schemas of high and low. Okay? We, of course, have seen that happen in movies. We have seen that happen in novels. We have seen that happen in many other domains. What's interesting that's happening here in food so late in some ways, or maybe it's just the right time. But is Chang's career trajectory and culinary product that different from what we have come to expect in a fast-moving field? Is this insurrection that insurrectionary? Let us check his precise pathway. He came to Momofuku via a liberal arts degree, which he says he did not find any use for, which of course can be said only by those who have it. Training at the French Culinary Institute in New York City and cooking at Café Boulou, property of New York's legendary chef Daniel Boulou. Then Chang traveled, lived and ate through Osaka and Tokyo, and the new culinary, I think, co-hegemon with France and Italy, since the days of Nouvelle French cuisine of Chef Paul Bocuse. What David Chang has done with East Asian-inflected American cuisine, borrowing from sources in Japanese and Korean noodle shops, is extraordinarily original. Yet his career path has been the standard route of the new American chef since the late 1980s. He received all the help from the right restaurant reviewers, just at the right time, as he willingly acknowledges, such as Frank Bruni of the New York Times, the Daily News, and the New York Magazine. He was consecrated quite early by the right set of institutions, such as the James Beard Foundation. He got the 2006 Rising Star Chef of the Year, and the Food and Wine magazine's Best New Chefs in 2006. It's about a decade now. He was aided by a small group of powerful Manhattan chefs such as Tom Colicchio at Kraft, Jonathan Beno at Per Se, and Andrew Carmelini at Café Ballou. So that makes it difficult to classify Chang as an outsider in any sense. Chang is perhaps more an imaginative insider, the network in which identities are made, deployed, and held together. Massimo Bottura, a chef owner of the 3 Michelin-starred Osteria Francescana in Modena, Italy, and listed as number 3 in the world's best restaurants in the world, etc., notes, when I'm in New York, I go to my friend's restaurant. People like David Chang, Daniel Boulou, Mario Batali, Wiley Dufresne, Torrisi Brothers, Alain Ducasse, if he's in town. Things have changed over the last 10 years in gastronomy. Chefs don't close their kitchens to other chefs anymore. Okay? Professions are built by shared knowledge and consecration. Very different from kitchen secrets, in fact. Okay? And you see that also in medicine and surgery, etc. It's about sharing. We travel all over the world and share techniques, experiences, and ideas with one another. He concludes, contemporary cuisine is not just about ingredients, it's also about quality of ideas, etc., etc. Chang, in fact, may be a very imaginative establishment figure, so much so that outsiders, and this is my last character in today's story, such as Eddie Huang, who is trying to break in, often targets Chang in the construction of more authentic selfhoods. He's going to have a show soon called Fresh Off the Boat. One way of doing that is to play up the race angle and the lack of culinary training. Eddie Huang screams, and I quote, "Americans, Americans, Americans," it's all capital. "They have called me chink, they have treated me like the other, they laughed at my food, they laughed at my family, they laughed at my culture, they wouldn't give me a proper interview because of my face. Americans, they did that." These are fighting words, end quote. These are fighting words, too strident even for the countercultural David Chang. Huang identifies strongly with the subversive, masculine, no-holds-barred hip-hop scene and clothing that he says is transgressive, satirical, do-it-yourself, democratic street culture. Their words, very self-conscious. In fact, attire and music are the 2 things young Americans have invested heavily in terms of their identity. Food follows, I think, in that footstep. I see that amongst my students. When I first came to this country, the first question my friends ask is, what music do you listen to? And I didn't have the right category. I said, well, Bollywood, pop. That was not a good category, because identity for young people was fixed on other categories of music, and food is becoming like that. What you eat, what you don't eat, where you eat, and where you don't eat is becoming very important to young people's identities. Then he takes, Eddie Huang takes on David Chang. David Chang is a chef who has unwittingly popularized a bastardized version of the Taiwanese guabao. I'm going to skip so that I can finish it next couple of minutes. He says, well, a Korean pork belly is really steamed pork belly. Asians don't use the oven for anything. David Chang cooks his pork belly in an oven, so it is not authentic. So he exposes Chang for roasting his pork belly, which is not original and which is not Asian enough. Too much originality in that. So these quarrels of distinctions are necessary in the overheated field of transnational urban gastronomy. This is how gastronomy fares in regions far from 18th century France. The link of chefs to modern professions and professionalism is tied to regimes of capital and cultural accumulation, refracted through American prisms of class and craft. And in fact, in this case, fragments of the East Asian world of artisanal production and evaluation are seeping into the West by way of the global hierarchy of value and fashion. Today, the world of American chef is being remade with strong influence from Japan and secondarily from Korea and Taiwan. And it continues to be the antithesis of the ethnic cook and the housewife, which is why the field is so acutely gendered and raced in a particular way, which is after the rise of East Asia as a major center of accumulation and decline of parts of it as a source of migrant labor. I think both these 2 things are important. If you have too much migrant labor at the bottom of the labor market, your cuisine cannot climb in the hierarchy of value. It gets contaminated. I think Italian plays a very interesting role of whiteness of a different kind, okay, of ethnicity. So cultural consecration follows in some ways cycles of accumulation and regimes of labor mobilization that professionally trained minorities can take advantage of. Everyday cooking has been for long been women's work, which when extricated from the household, institutionalized and upscaled, demands a kind of performative masculinity to generate protective boundaries of exclusion around it. Amy Trubeck, a trained chef and an anthropologist, notes, I quote, "The desire to be a professional and artist was part of the larger inclination to not be other things and to avoid," this is my warning to myself, shut up, I will in 2 minutes. The practice of chefs had links to activities. Let me repeat. The desire to be a professional and artist was part of a larger inclination to not be other things, to avoid any suggestion that the practice of chefs had links to activities lower in the social division of labor. The practice of chefs was cooking, so they were particularly concerned with disengaging themselves from the association of cooking with women's work that occurred solely in the domestic sphere, end quote. Boundaries, of course, are based on salient social categories, such as gender, race, and ethnicity. The other categorical locus of low-prestige cooking, in addition to the home, of course, is the ethnic eatery, which is a cook shop run by a poor working class or downwardly mobile immigrant. The discourse of haute cuisine and the practice of restaurant cookery overwhelmingly produces male, white, and Asian international chefs, where international, in fact, is the opposite of the ethnic. Which is why Chinese cuisine in America has had such a difficult time acquiring the patina of haute-ness, contaminated as it is by the proximity of poor immigrant co-ethnics. It's the oldest ethnic cuisine in that sense. And we haven't had, and pointing to my first point, we haven't had serious academic work about Chinese restaurateurs until very, very recently, 5 or 10 years ago. So boundaries between the world of haute, ethnic, and foreign had to be marked. The new social world of the American chef, who until the 1960s, by the way, and this is very interesting, was dismissed as a mere cipher for a servant, and in fact counted among them until the 1940 census, comes implicated in fresh normative hierarchies and regimes of capital and cultural accumulation, and the ways in which they intersect with patterns of current labor mobilization. And so, to finish off, this is where kind of my work focuses on, in terms of cooked food, the greatly fragmented New York City market and its erratic changes over time, which in fact protects it from chains and corporations. All of them may be standalone restaurants or small chains. So it's an important distinction to make. These are not Burger Kings. Okay, there are in terms of chains, McDonald's, which need at least $1 million, $2 million, $3 million investment, but do not have cultural capital. Providing opportunities to new immigrants and native entrepreneurs, but at a cost of excessive competition, narrow profit margins, high risk of failure. So this is where, in fact, the commodity meets the cultural entrepreneur. It is the cultural entrepreneur in the figure of the restaurateur, the restaurant critic, and the journalist, who stands squarely in the middle of the discussion about American culture today, which has always been about low and popular, rather than aloof and cultured with a capital C. From jazz to movies to rock and roll to Madison Avenue. So it is in fact a dialectic between, and I'm fascinated by it because between cultural democracy and distinction. Both are being played out in ways. Between networks, which are rhizomic, and hierarchies. Okay? And profession making and breaking, because there is of course no social space that is empty for a profession to enter. For any profession to be born and enter, they have to elbow others who are surrounding it. Okay? And that's why it takes a particularly performative form of masculinity to play in this field, is an elbowing of others who are occupying spaces that are not socially available in some ways. So, and threaded together with a particular kind of institutional cooking that seems to have escaped the triviality barrier of cooking, which is where I started. Thank you. We'll take questions. More beautiful pictures. It's designer walls.
When you speak about the ethnic restaurants, say in Manhattan, when you have immigrant groups that are gathered, is there some type of, not an entrepreneurial action, but sort of a social action where the groups themselves say, we need our own food, or, so it's almost a push and pull for that activity?
Absolutely. Okay, this works. Exactly. And in fact, and there's a tension between the two. Okay? And so, for instance, say Indian food, or in fact, Indian food, of course, is an abstraction like, say, European food, right? So if you get for more regional, to give you an example, in Queens, you will get the more regionalized versions of it, which is mostly targeted towards the South Asian audience, even if they're cross-eating, Nepali eating Bangladeshi food, okay? But in Manhattan, in that space, which is partly because it's expensive, the outward-looking cuisine is that the Indian category. So even if you're Bangladeshi or Pakistani, the category that works for you is Indian cuisine, because there's not enough demand. And there's a tug of war between, in some ways, inside the community. And there's kind of a beautiful example, simply names. We can find out by names of restaurants. If you look at, say, the first 50 restaurants, Chinese restaurants in New York, they're all in Chinatown, and all of them have Chinese names, no English names, internally directed, okay? And all the Indian restaurants, the earliest Indian restaurants, they're all around Midtown, because partly the population is not large enough for a Chinatown, for an India town, and all of them are in English, and they're referencing very widely, like to Turkey, to the Arabian Peninsula, and to India. So it takes, for one of the earliest restaurants, the restaurant, New York Times reporter writes, this is Turkish food, which is also Arab food, which is kind of like Indian food. It serves tamarind, this drink, which is made from the roots of the tamarind tree. People are absolutely lost in the classification, and it takes about a decade to figure out what this food is, okay? And so there's this mutual constitution. So when you have Chinatowns, you will have first the inward-looking ones, okay, which is serving the population, and then Chinatown chop suey craze. We think we have a craze with ramen noodles, or we think we have a craze with sushi. The chop suey craze was the greatest craze, 1920s, okay? And it pours out of Chinatown in 1920. And it rushes uptown, okay, up to 54th Street. So until 1915, abstract date, like date for modernism, right, 1914. Let's stick to that. Until 1914, Chinese food in New York City is an insider food in Chinatown. After 1914, it spills out and is aggressively marketed, and there's and all of them acquire chop suey in their names. Okay, and and these are subtle entrepreneurs trying to figure out a market, a conservative market they can play with. They know what works. Okay, and then some degree of innovation as they get out. So it's generally, because it's a high risk and narrow profit field, it tends to be conservative. It is very difficult to get imaginative Chinese or Indian food in Manhattan. Very difficult. You have to kind of, it's partly because the profit margins are so narrow. You do what you do what your compatriots are doing, okay, because you know they have done it and they barely stay afloat. Because remember, we're talking about a market in which real estate costs are very high. Yes.
I don't know that I know chop suey, but the one I've had it's horrible. So why did it explode like that?
See, this is, of course, how much of it is about good food, how much of it is about what you think is good food. I'll let the anthropologist decide. So the Levi-Straussian question, right? Good to think with. It became part of a style. To be cosmopolitan, to be fashionable, you had to take your girlfriend to a chop suey place. you will often have a Chinese place, who would offer steak for the man, and his mistress chop suey. Because that's another very interesting thing. Women are always assigned this space as fickle but innovative in their taste. By the way, Bourdieu's work confirms that. Women's taste, at least in his French work, is at least 2 class fractions higher than the same male's taste.
Always.
You know, always, in some ways, and that they're much more innovative, they're much more, so they're playing to it. So you'll have a place, Chinese place, with a steak, and then chop suey. Chop suey for the mistress, steak for the serious guy who can't tolerate chop suey. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the place of food writing in all of this. So it's always struck me that New York Times, the Wednesday food issue, dining issue, which fluctuates one time between reviewing restaurants, but another time about dining in. And I'm fascinated because that follows the similar pattern to what you're outlining. So even when they're trying to tell you how to make one-dish meals or trying to tell you how to make vegetarian food, it remains the furthest out they'll go. I mean, Mediterranean food has, the status of Japanese food in this,
Yep.
they sort of fetishize it to the
Yep.
point of, but that always bugs me because, Indian home cooking would seem very easy, it would seem very nutritious, but it's never there. David Tanis now sometimes talks about it, but
He just did one on
on
naan,
dosa,
right? On dosas.
which is the hardest thing to make.
The hardest thing to do.
I mean,
I haven't
everybody.
I haven't had the courage to do that yet.
What goes on with the world of food writing?
I think it's 2 things. One, something acquires power because it's difficult. Because it's a signature of effort, authenticity, skill. It's also kind of a celebration of a particular kind of skill, and it basically separates the real cooks from those who are just dabbling in it. Okay, so part of that has become a very important part of course, Manhattan is in fact not the leading edge now. Brooklyn is the leading edge of those kinds of claims. Young professionals who are taking the food very seriously, too seriously, maybe, and that's becoming quite a competitive field. And what is intriguing is, of course, this has happened in other parts of the field, aesthetic field, and which used to be more durable, art, classic, right? Fiction, for instance. It's very interesting seeing it happening in the domain of an everyday form of skills. In the process of doing that, it is very important for people to demonstrate skills to each other. And again, I don't want to be cynical about it. Part of it is good, serious, interesting work. That's very cool. The other part of it is the showmanship of it.
They include women. There are
Include
more
women.
women food writers than chefs.
Always been, and it gets dominated in the middle period, and now women, in some ways, it happened in fact lots of fields. So you have, until the unnamed, unheroic reviewers are all women in New York Times, until Craig Claiborne, okay, 1962. Don't hold me to that exact date, somewhere around that. And he becomes the first named authoritative, consecrated. For instance, when he first writes about Indian food, he doesn't know it, he doesn't understand. So there's a big picture of an Indian woman he talks to who is a diplomat in the United Nations. He has a picture of it authenticated by, she's in a sari, okay, and all this artifacts, which is authenticating the borrowed expertise of the expert, okay? But after he does that for about 7 years, he then moves on. He goes to Delhi, he visits all the restaurants, and by then he has become an expert, he has claimed that space, okay? So it is in some ways a dynamic space of where people don't know, and they acquire expert knowledge, and then they display that knowledge, and how that knowledge then, of course, this is partly reception. How are people who are reading it also absorbing this knowledge, okay? And maybe just reading it. In fact, I have mostly read the New York Times, and have just started cooking from the New York Times relatively recently, especially because we have had too many snowstorms. A lot of time in my hand. Oh, by the way, this is the opposite of the hierarchy. This is the discursive popularity one. So in some ways, you see, I mean, this is fantastic. Sorry, German is a fantastic case, okay? if you read the New York Times, 1880 to 1910, German food is being discussed like interesting, exciting, disgusting German food. Okay? Like all the claims of ethnicity. Okay? And then it, of course, plummets. The discussion plummets absolutely, the count. And there may be two things going on. One is what I think what anthropologists are very good at. It is being lost in plain view. Hamburger, hot dogs. So in some ways, what is American cuisine is Germanic cuisine in some ways. Okay? So it is no longer marked. So German food slides under the radar as ethnically marked at one side. And of course, the other side, what's also happening is the name becomes a liability through the 2 world wars. Okay? And German language use as a second language in schools, is the most popular second language in the schools, declines dramatically through the 2 world wars as an act of patriotism. Okay? Little like, what was the thing about French fries? Patriot fries, or what was freedom fries. It's some of that. But that is an amazing one. It completely vanishes from discussion. So ethnicity, in fact, is a marker that lasts only for so many decades. In fact, right now, nobody in the New York Times uses ethnic anymore, the word ethnic anymore. It has gone out of fashion, which I argue is the perfect time to look back at it. Okay? Because it has become a broad, we know it's a general category of the other. Okay? That has become unsustainable. And people, New York Times, I think the last time they used ethnic was 2006. In reference to cuisine. And even to people, I don't recall exactly my search. Sorry, there was some question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Similar to the question about food writing, what do you think the changes in food media, like or reviewing software like Yelp and Foursquare, have done for ethnic food?
Two things. They made it more accessible to younger people who have a ken for two things. Different food, because partly they are rebelling against their parents' taste, their conservative choices, and so they come to New York City, and many of them, 90%, my students, that's my very internal survey, want to eat all kinds of things. And they can now, of course, they could always, and they could talk to each other, but there was an ephemerality of orality. Okay, couldn't be recorded. Now that's why we have so much data, because now it can be recorded. Okay, and with pictures and with words, it has created a whole rich universe in some ways, what the French already did in the 18th century. French cuisine is French cuisine because in some ways, one of the arguments is a chef is a cook who writes his way out of the kitchen. And the French did it the first. And they are both because chefs are writing, but especially gastronomic writers who are all male. French gastronomic writers are all male. English gastronomic writers are all female initially. Stephen Menel's fantastic work about gender and these forms of knowledge. English food never acquires the haute cuisine French reputation, which is kind of fantastic work if you're interested in Norbert Elias's work and Stephen Menel's work and how that happens, how it is partly linked to urbanization and the center of power. His argument is the English city is not that much the center of power as Versailles and Paris is, and he links it to absolutism and the concentration of power, and how quickly fork usage, cuisine, and all those kinds of knowledge spreads from the center of it. So that's also, so what I find is the durability of what used to be ephemeral, and the upside of durability, of course, is people like me can come along and then harvest it to tell a story. But of course, now we have the problem of too much information. I don't even know how to navigate it anymore. So a lot of this is distant reading. Close reading is, I'll be completely swamped. I've spent the rest of my life doing this. I'll probably just be reading each of these articles. So in my work, I have to do the right ratio of enough distant reading and then enough close reading to get a sense. I mean, think about Franco Moretti's work on literature, right? This kind of a balance is, for me, is useful to think about. And for instance, I count a Yelp review and survey. When I do Zagat's, I do Yelp, and what else? Of course, Michelin. which is in some ways the traditional, which of course is fantastic because it's by a tire company. What is a tire company doing is because they are mostly linked to tourism. They're linked to travel. So they want to propose out-of-the-way restaurants, so you travel there on Michelin tires. That's how they become. Yeah, so and El Bulli is a terrific example. For us, they put it somewhere nobody can get there. To get there, you have to kind of do extraordinary effort. Then they shut it down for 6 months, a year. Then they shut it down forever. Now the rest of us can't eat it anymore. So you cannot be consecrated because you'll always be in the crowd of people who never ate at El Bulli. End of story. Can't belong in any field, in that kind of heights of a field. Questions, thoughts? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could shed some light from a comparative perspective of the difference in the East Asian immigrant restaurateur experience in other countries. I was thinking specifically of in South Asia. I'm from Calcutta, and now there is a specific brand of cuisine which is Indian Chinese cuisine, such that there are Indian Chinese restaurants in Manhattan now. So I was wondering, and that trajectory feels quite different. So I was wondering if
all my family, when they go to not all of them, some of them have gone to China, says, well, Chinese food in China is not good. Chinese food in Calcutta is the fantastic Chinese food. It's the best Chinese food in the world. Okay? So these are again the question of what's in your head and what's in your palate, God knows. Okay? And yes, and this is partly linked to your question of insider-outsider. So in Manhattan now you have Indian Chinese food. And so if you're white and if you're young, you are really cool if you like Indian Chinese food because that allows you to make very fine distinctions. There's Chinese food, there's Chinese food, Chinese regional food. Nobody says Chinese food anymore. If you're cool, you can't use Chinese food. And then if you go after Indian Chinese food, that means like your nuance and subtlety. And there are two things. It's like me eating sushi. I hated it first time. But I kept eating it because everybody said I should like it. I ate it, and then I developed a palate for it, and I love it. Now I can distinguish good sushi. Like my colleagues used to say at the Culinary Institute about wine. I come from a culture in which we don't have that kind of wine drinking. I said, you got to teach me wine. He says, well, you teach me about books. I said, so what do you mean? He says, it's just like the books. First, you have to read it. So first, you have to drink it. Second, you have to articulate what you like and you don't like. Third, you have to classify. You like that wine, you like white, you like red, you like this grape, this region. You basically develop an encyclopedia of classification, okay, and be able to make distinctions, okay. If you have read one book, I mean, you like it, it's the book, Bible. You like it, you don't make aesthetic judgments about it. And if you have read 100,000 books, 10,000 books, you'll make distinctions about it. So that's what's getting played out. So in some ways, some of it is silly, but it's kind of a lot of fun watching this happening because we think it's only happening now in food because it's happening in front of us, but that's also happening in each of these aesthetic domain is this kind of refinement, calibration, distinction. So the capacity to make distinction for me, for sushi, was completely built on the social acceptability of sushi eating. The same reason I gave up smoking. Not because it's bad for me, but because nobody cool was smoking anymore. And socially it was not possible. It was not acceptable as the coolness factor. We are social subjects like that. We don't act individually. I don't, at least. And to watch this happen. And Indian Chinese is one version of that. It's partly playing to this insider Indian and India returned second generation, third generation Indian Americans and their friends and colleagues. Because remember, like you, they are in these top-notch universities. So your friends who want to be cool want to eat some of your food that's cool for you. That's why you get to Indian Chinese. Yes. The microphone. Oh, sorry.
I have another category for you.
Yes.
Vegan.
Vegan.
Yeah, I actually have to be vegan for medical reasons, and it's interesting because ethnic food is easy for me. Per se would be a nightmare.
It is, absolutely.
I've gone to expensive restaurants. I get a little crescent of artfully arranged vegetables. I'm starving.
Still don't know how to do vegetables. No, exactly.
And then the other thing is that people who are at vegan restaurants, the expensive good ones, are all young. So I'm wondering if that's starting to.
I mean, two things. Again, it's like one of it is, of course, many are ethical vegans, and so philosophical reasons about it, good reason to be one, and some are in some ways much more embedded cultural one, like Indian vegetarians, for instance. So that is getting played out. But almost like because we are social animals, anything we do can also become competitive. You know, and some of that gets played out with. In fact, I think, and maybe vegan is not in your case, but I think amongst some of my younger students, it's ethics that's driving it, very good reasons, as I said. But part of also what's driving a lot of their behavior, may or may not be vegan particularly, is in fact, what defines young people now is what you don't eat. And by the way, and that's not that far from zero-calorie drinks. So now our most valorized drinks are drinks that have nothing in them. Zero this, zero that, zero that. Coca-Cola, zero. And we love it. We get nothing from it. So that's, in some ways, I think, is an asymptote of ultimate affluence. So I think it's not, we're not doing it consciously, but I think what it is about affluence and girth's association with its class inversion. Okay? And what's getting played out now is people who eat things that have nothing in them. And that's a good thing. It's kind of caricature of it. Okay? And so kind of I think a lot of things are going into, and as I said, it's a very good reason if you care about animals not to be eating, though I kind of can't resist yet, but I'm trying, reducing my number. It's a very good reason. And it's easy. If I do Indian cooking, it's very easy to do vegetarian cooking.
And know more health-wise
Also.
why it's important, and I wonder if health is going to become
It is.
important.
It is an important. I think three things are going on, and one of them is health. Absolutely. And of course, health is an understanding about the body, and we cannot be extricated from biosociality, right? And so, what is considered good and healthy? And part of it is driven by changes in nutritional information, like eggs are coming back big time. Okay, and nobody's saying. Yeah, and Atkins phases. Some people said Atkins, for instance, that's a good example. Atkins allowed men to diet without appearing wussy. Okay, so there is kind of health, there is certain kind of claims that work, there are also cultural claims that are, and they cannot be extricated. So what I'm saying is aesthetics, ethics, okay, practice, everyday practice, philosophical postures are entangled, which is why it is in some ways a dense social fact. That's fun to unpack. It's coming back, yes.
When you're talking about food and identity, are
Yes.
those quarrels of distinction ever economically based or economically based by generation? So, for example, are people who, you said young people like Indian, Chinese cuisine, is it because of cost or is that never a
Good, excellent point. Most sociological research is showing that as your income goes up, as your education goes up, you're more omnivorous. That is, in fact, we have moved from the snob structure of culture to the omnivore structure of culture. That you listen to hip hop, you listen to jazz, you listen to pop, you listen to country, etc. If your education is high, if your income is high. In fact, people lower down in the education and income level are in fact univores. Only country music, only hip hop. Okay, so one is that patterning that in some ways has flipped the aesthetic hierarchy in some ways. Okay, and the second part is the young, especially the American young, have always played a role in breaking some of these barriers of hierarchy, including jazz, including club dancing, including hip hop. I mean, think about when my stepson, who is kind of lily white, all he would listen to was hip hop. And I couldn't figure out, but that's kind of, his social world was mostly white, suburban, and they were all only listening to hip hop. Okay? And they were far ahead of me. A, as an immigrant, B, as older, to catch up on that. I never caught up with that, okay? So, plus in this case, with ethnic food, related to your question too, tends to be cheaper. And it's a way to deploy, in some ways, cultural power from the bottom up. If you have some amount, if you're young, you use that to shame the older, affluent gourmand who is eating haute French cuisine. He doesn't know that it is way outdated. You got to eat David Chang's food with chopstick to be cool. And that's going on. You can see that. You can see that going on, the dynamic of it. So yes, economics is also driving access, and the discussion in the media is shaping. The discussion is becoming louder and louder. In fact, the French discussion is subsiding dramatically, I think, this one. You can see that. Look at this. This is just counting the discussion that's going on, okay? But this is the clutter, but this is still New York Times. I do that with various newspapers in different markets. I'm just showing you New York Times today. Italian, look at this. It's kind of amazing how it comes up, and kind of very interesting transformation that's going on. And Italian, in some ways, you should take a look at Simone, what's his first name? On Italian-American food, and especially his work is fantastic on Italian-American winemakers, how they became important. Italian-American winemaking is a little like Jews and Italians in the movie business. They come as a subaltern group, and they take it over in a very interesting way. So in some ways, that's why I like to balance hierarchy with disruption of hierarchy, because that's also the persistent American story, okay? And you see that even in winemaking, okay, as in movie making, dominated by Jews and Italian Catholics, okay, as subaltern groups. And they come over, and so it's partly about capital, how much money they can raise, et cetera, and that transformed that field in some ways, happening similarly, interestingly, with food. You can leave, you don't have to stay. Who would have thought Nordic cuisine would be the best cuisine in the world, right? Out of, like, basically herbs and stuff growing on rocks, okay? That for the last 4 years is supposed to be the best cuisine in the world. Noma, okay?